Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Our series for May has been When Public Schools Open, Let's Make Our Schools Stronger. And so we've been joined tonight by other panelists who have been to help us talk about this topic about what we need to do in terms of funding or policies or other issues if we really want to open our schools and we want to make sure that our schools are strong and ready to go. So tonight, I'm really thrilled to have joined me a wonderful powerhouse of folks tonight who are going to be on our panel. Kris Nordstrom, Monika Johnson-Hostler, Lindsay Wagner, and Terrance Ruth. And I wanted to take a second just to let you join me. You can see the screen and I will introduce you to Kris. Kris is the Senior Policy Analyst with the North Carolina Justice Center. The Education and Law Project. Kris has been the lead researcher and author of numerous research reports, policy briefs, and commentaries that focus on education policy and its impact on advancing economic and social justice. Kris has been for 4 years, I think, with the Justice Center, but actually many of us knew him when he was at the North Carolina General Assembly in the Nonpartisan Fiscal Research Division, where he did a lot of budget analysis and information to members of the General Assembly, and as well worked very closely with divisions like the Department of Public Instruction and those places to help make sure that we had good data on education. Kris has a Master's of Public Policy from Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke, and his undergraduate degree from Wake Forest. Also tonight, we have Monika Johnson-Hostler. So glad she's here tonight because she's here as a representative of a school board, and this one happens to be in Wake County. I know that Wake County is the largest school system in Wake County, so we're hoping that she'll be able to give us some really good insight to the struggles and challenges and successes that she sees that the public school system can bring about to open our schools. Monika has been was elected first in 2013. She's been re-elected in 2016 and 18. She served as chair of the board for 2 years. She is an executive director of the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Monika is the policy go-to person in all things related to federal legislation and the broader anti-sexual violence movement. So we're really proud of to have Monika here with her, as we call her, day job experience and helpfulness, as well as her job on the school board. Lindsay Wagner is a senior writer researcher. Lindsay supports the forum by providing research, analysis, and reporting. She's with the Public Schools Forum, I hope I said that, and issues related to public education. And prior to joining the Public School Forum, she was with the Fletcher Foundation, and before that with NC Policy Watch at the NC Justice Center. So she is very experienced and really has a keen eye for writing in a way that the public can understand what's going on with some of these very convoluted policies and procedures. She has her master's degree in international education policy from University of Maryland at College Park and her undergraduate degree in French and business. So our last panelist I'll introduce is Dr. Terrance Ruth. He is an education consultant with Public Schools First. He's a former administrator of Wake County Public Schools. He previously held an education policy research position at the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at NC State. He has his master's degree in social school administration and management and his PhD in public affairs. Dr. Ruth has worked in K through 12 schools in Florida and Wake County. He's been an administrator, he's been a teacher. He now is a professor at NC State and serves as president at the Justice Love Foundation. And I like to add that he's also tonight a parent of a kindergartner this year in the public school system. So that's going to be another way that he'll be able to contribute to our conversation tonight. So we're going to get started, and thank you all. I mean, I'm just so honored to be in your presence because I can't think of a more qualified panel than what we have here tonight. So to get started, I wanted to just maybe, before we get too deep into all these issues talking about reopening our schools, I just wondered if anyone wanted to share any reactions to remote learning, what we are learning so far, the things that we're seeing going on from our unique perspectives, any success stories, challenges, any concerns that you think are worth sharing with our audience tonight before we dig into some of these other issues. Whoops, I jumped ahead, excuse me. Sorry. Okay. Wait a minute, I don't know what happened, y'all. There we are. Forgive me. I'm trying to. Okay, so I'll open the floor up for anybody who would like to comment on that.
I'm happy to go first. Lindsay Wagner here. Thanks for having me tonight. Really excited to be with everyone. Not only am I a writer for the forum, but I also have 3 children. One is a first grader in Wake County schools. The other is a preschooler, and then I have a 1-year-old. So remote learning has been challenging, but I have to say, first and foremost, I've been really impressed with our school's principal, our school's teachers, and really how Wake County has handled this massive shift very quickly. I would say the first week was a little bit challenging in terms of teachers trying to figure out a balance between keeping, a high level of quality and rigor going with regard to remote learning, but also balancing the needs of a household and working families. But pretty quickly, teachers adapted and have shown once again how incredibly adaptable they are. And we're in a pretty good rhythm now where we're able to accomplish some learning goals each day, but also hold on to some sanity as well. I am concerned about families that just don't have access to broadband high-speed internet, because it's very clear that in order to achieve the learning goals that have been set forth, you really have to have that, as well as pretty good support at home. So I think that that will be a big challenge for everyone going forward.
I'm happy to go next. Like Lindsay, not only am I on the school board, but I also, my husband's a public school educator here in Wake County, and my daughter is also in the 9th grade. So I am actually getting to experience learning from both angles every single day. They're both on either side of where we have ourselves set up now in our home. So my daughter's on one side, my husband's on the other side. And I would truly say that not just for Wake County, but talking to my colleagues across the state, people really all hopped into complete high gear to figure out how to make public schools work for as many students as possible. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge that public schools had a very different challenge than other schools, because our job was to ensure that as many, if not all, students would have access to whatever teaching and learning we attempted to do through remote learning. Some of our smaller school districts were already one-to-one, but not necessarily did that translate to internet or high-speed internet. As you mentioned, Lindsay, Wake County was very similar. We ordered 10,000 hotspots. So people were complaining about the length of time that it took us to get remote learning up and running, but we as a board were very committed to not starting teaching and learning till all students could have access. And so we distributed thousands of computers and thousands of hotspots to go along with that. I certainly agree that our teachers, who are both parents and teachers, have done a tremendous job of trying to teach their students that they're the educator for, but also managing children at home as educators as well. Fortunately, we don't have a young child, so it's a little bit easier for us, but I certainly have friends and colleagues who are trying to balance both teaching and parenting, and I keep reminding them that for your child, you are their facilitator, not their teacher. So help facilitate the learning to the best that you can. And if it all fails, just go in the kitchen and start measuring and cooking. And those are actual objectives that we really should give ourselves the space to be okay with during this time, because it is difficult and challenging. But I think there are a ton of successes, and I still think the biggest challenge is we dropped the teachers and educators into this without any professional development, without any standardized teaching tools for remote learning. Not all teachers were using flipped classrooms or videos or even recorded a video. So now you have teachers looking at both themselves and their students trying to teach a Zoom class. And so I think not enough people acknowledge that, yes, they're educators, but no educator we have was prepared for 100% remote learning. And that's essentially what they were left to do. And so I think we've done as well as we can, but I still think we have a great ways to go considering we still don't know what's next.
And just to piggyback off of both Lindsay and Monika, just watching, I've had the opportunity to teach and to observe a classroom with an amazing teacher. And there's something about that chemistry between the teacher and the student in that close proximity that's very hard to translate into virtual classrooms. And so having these virtual classrooms for a long extended time is very difficult to keep that excitement, sort of that magic that occurs in a four-wall classroom. And so for me, it's been observing my son sort of excitement and sort of his endurance in class in virtual settings, and watching teachers try to adjust in real time to really meet the need of their students. But I'm proud to see the great work that teachers are doing and that principals are doing to really try to adjust to this really uncertain time.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to cap things off, I shouldn't have gone last because I probably have the least interesting thing to say here since I don't have children, so I haven't been witnessing this firsthand. But I think, what we've learned so far just in general is, this is not news to anyone here on the panel, of course, but, that our schools have gross inequities that are, functions of a lot of societal ills, and as well as, the way we fund our schools and the policies that are created to run our schools. And a lot of those inequities have been exacerbated through this shutdown and shift to remote learning. Of course, not all families have access to high-speed internet. Not all parents are able to sit and help their children learn online. And then also physical space. I'm incredibly lucky here in my house. My wife and I are both working. We each have enough room that we have our own offices. And, for a lot of families don't have that luxury.
That's right.
Well, there'll need to be a lot of extra effort once things return back to the in-school setting to sort of reverse those inequities. And I think and then as far as challenges and concerns, I know schools are doing a lot of amazing work, and they've had to do it at the drop of a hat with very little to no planning and on shoestring budgets. But I think we need to remember that remote learning is no substitute in the long run for face-to-face learning. We've seen that through virtual charter schools and what failures they've been, even though those are schools that are specifically designed to provide remote learning. And even those schools have huge trouble, actually, at least in terms of academics, having their students reach achievement levels that anyone thinks are of high quality.
Well, I'm going to just jump from that, Kris, because when you talk about these inequities, it always leads me to want to talk about the big important issue that we're facing is funding. And so as we're looking at even trying, Monika, when you were talking about ordering 10,000 hotspots, I thought, wow, Wake County can do that. I don't think Robeson County can do that. I don't think that, Halifax County can do that. And so it really, and when we're talking now about this short-term kind of thing, we're going to be a total of like 3 months of this experiment. And then we're shifting our conversation to reopening our schools. So let's talk a little bit about funding, what you've seen so far, what you think is needed. A lot of people want to know what this CARES Act is. So anyone that would like to lead, I know Kris and Lindsay, you've paid very close attention to these budgets and these bills that have been going through. So anything you'd like to share with the public, because I'm also hoping that we can end this webinar tonight with information for our attendees on ways that they can be involved with their elected officials to figure out how, how they can support things that we need. So.
Sure. Well, I'll take the first stab at that and talk about the CARES Act. So a lot of people who, if you follow state politics, you probably saw that the General Assembly about 3 weeks ago was in session, very end of April, beginning of May, to distribute a lot of money. And that was all federal money from the CARES Act. So the big pots for North Carolina received $3.6 billion from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That's all federal money. This is all money that also, it must be spent on things that are related to COVID-19. So it can't be used to just generally fill budget holes. It has to address the additional costs that have arisen for the state as a result of COVID. And it all must be spent by December 30th. So the General Assembly, they met at the end of April, appropriated $1.6 billion of the $3.6 billion. So for public schools, they received about $226 million of that $1.6 billion. The state board had, prior to that session, had put together a request of what they thought they needed, which was $380 million. So the school districts did receive some money from that, but in the way that the General Assembly does things, I think they've been penny pinching, and it's not even their money, and it's money that has to be spent by the end of the year. So I'm not sure why exactly they are only giving schools part of what they need and setting them up for failure, in my opinion. So for a good example is on devices. The General Assembly only, they provided them some funding, but just 35% of what the state board asked for. Mental health, and we know that's going to be a huge issue when children return back to school. The General Assembly only funded 18% of the state board's request on mental health. Why are they holding this money back? I think, to be generous, I think they might be considering whether or not there are additional costs that arise that they just haven't foreseen yet. But they also might, I think, are banking on whether or not the federal government will change their guidance and allow this money to be used to fill back holes in state budgets. From what we're hearing so far, we think that state revenue will be down probably in the range of 4 billion or so, 4 billion plus. So, somewhere 15, 20%. So huge reductions in state revenue. So that will require federal money in order to offset those state revenue decreases. But I think we also have huge costs arising right now, and we need to address those costs immediately. And then it would be helpful if our state leaders were lobbying the delegates up in Washington, D.C. to provide our state with the fiscal relief it needs to deal with the fiscal problem after that. But they need to be acting now to address the additional costs we have in our schools.
Kris, I have a quick question before Lindsay jumps in. On this money that the State Board of Education had asked for, so that money goes to them and then they will spend that accordingly in dispersing services and devices or whatever it is they need to the local school systems? Is that how that works?
They'll need to come up with policies for how to distribute those funds across school districts. So there is a second pot of funds, in addition to the $3.6 billion that goes to the state for the state to allocate across all of state government where there are additional costs. There's an additional pot of about $360 million that will be going directly to the school districts and the charter schools. And that will be then spent at the discretion of the school districts. That's allocated based on the Title I formula.
And Monika, are you able to use those funds right now? do you already have them, if you would, in the bank that you can use them to handle some of these closing out the school year or summertime getting ready money, or when are you going to get those dollars at the
We
local
don't know
level?
when we're going to get the dollars. We just got the amounts total per school system this week. So we actually saw the finalized chart this week.
Okay, so you haven't had access to it. Okay, so Lindsay, I
Right.
wanted to let you kind of talk a little bit too about this issue with local funding, relevant bills, anything that you think that would help our public understand where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of different things I want to talk about. First, just generally talk about Leandro. For those who are not familiar, in 1997, the state Supreme Court declared that the state constitution guarantees every child has the opportunity to receive a sound basic education. And so since that time, the courts have repeatedly found that we as a state have not invested in our system of public schools to ensure that this is happening equitably across our state. And this year, there have been more developments in this case known as Leandro that have included a new report by an independent consultant that has indeed found we need to invest a considerable amount of money. The exact amount is a little bit up for debate, but that we need to invest significantly more resources into our system of public schools to meet this constitutional obligation. I'm sorry. I knew that was going to happen.
I like life to happen.
That's
You know,
right.
Lindsay, I have to say while you're trying to hold the door and talk that I'd forgotten that how quickly your children have grown up. I thought they were still in preschool. I can't believe you have a first grader. And she may be stronger than you holding that door there.
If they create a human chain, Lindsay, I feel really bad for you.
I'm gonna be quick. All of this is to say, you know, we are still not meeting our constitutional obligation. And earlier this week, Senator Berger, you know, sort of implied that if we don't have the funds available to meet it, that his hands are sort of tied. We responded to that in a news article today to simply say that just because we're in the middle of this crisis, it doesn't mean that our constitutional obligation goes away, and that we have to find a way to prioritize the funds that are accessible to us in order to meet this obligation that requires us to offer every child a sound basic education. There are a couple of bills right now that that address Leandro to an extent, and that offer a blueprint for us beginning to meet this challenge. House
What are
Bill,
those? Do you know those bill numbers? Have you?
so House Bill 1130 is sponsored by Democrats. They're all sponsored by Democrats. The House Bill 1130 is Julie Von Hafen, Representative Gill, Hunt, and Russell, and this would increase funding for economically disadvantaged students, low-performing schools, pre-kindergarten slots, and help students get access to broadband. It's only sponsored by Democrats, so we'll see if it goes anywhere. House Bill 1129, also sponsored by Democrats, these being Representative Greg Meyer, Ashton Clemens, and Cynthia Ball, would do also a number of different things to change education policy. It would create an opportunity gap task force that could consider effective approaches and best practices from across the country to close the opportunity gap in grades K through 12. It also would end the unaccountable opportunity scholarship program known as vouchers, which diverts millions of public dollars to private schools that are not held to any kind of academic or financial standards. The bill would also modify the A through F school grading system so that it better balances student growth against student achievement, aligns the school calendar with the community college calendar, and offers better budget flexibility for local school boards with regard to teacher assistant funding. So those are two bills that we're watching. Again, they are only sponsored by Democrats at this time. There are a few other bills that I think folks should keep their eyes on as this session progresses. One subject, again, is broadband. The majority of North Carolina can access high-speed internet or broadband, but only about 60% of households have adopted broadband, citing cost as the #1 barrier. So there are a couple of bipartisan bills that would appropriate state funds for the School Connectivity Initiative in order to maximize eligibility for federal funds. There's also another bill that would provide funding to the DIT to expedite and expand broadband infrastructure in the state through something known as a GREAT program that funnels money to internet service providers.
Lindsay, did you happen
yeah.
to, what were those bill numbers again for the last two you said? I want our audience to hear those.
The Leandro bills or the
I got the 1129, 1130. The last two you talked about broadband. Did you happen to remember those?
I did not write them down, but I can.
We'll look them up and we will tell everybody in the follow-up email.
Great. Just a couple more bills that I wanted to highlight, and then I'll turn the mic over to someone else, not my daughter. Hopefully. Senate Bill 711 is a Republican-sponsored bill that would change eligibility for the Opportunity Scholarship Program, notably making it possible for current private school students to receive a voucher. It also increases the funds available for vouchers by $2 million for each year going forward until 2026. Senate Bill 800 designates federal coronavirus funding for purposes such as addressing shortfalls in education funding. It's called the Law Enforcement and Teacher Protection Act. Senator Berger sent a press release out about this bill earlier this week, I think, and it would create reserve accounts to fund salaries for teachers, police officers, and other critical North Carolina employees. I think a number of people have been talking about being concerned in this economic environment if there will be teacher layoffs, and it would appear this bill may address that, but I haven't dug into it deeply.
So yeah, if I can just add a little bit on that bill, I think that bill, that reserve fund would be funded from the leftover money from the coronavirus relief fund, the additional $2 billion.
Okay.
But it would still need to be appropriated from the General Assembly. And, you know, there's still nothing in there. The uses, the allowable uses that they put in there are broad enough. They also include things like ensuring continuation of government services broadly, and some other things. So, and testing and all sorts of other things. So even though it's titled that it's that'll guarantee teacher salaries, I would, you know, the proof is in the pudding. We'll see what actual funding looks like. There's no guarantee just from that bill.
I've seen that.
And that number again was, what was that Senate bill again?
800.
800.
Okay.
Yep.
It sounds so this bill is worth reviewing and keeping an eye on, because it sounds it's very ripe for a lot of things to be added to it.
For sure.
For sure.
For sure.
Okay.
Two other bills worth mentioning. There is a bipartisan bill in the House to restore master's degree pay. This has come up before. Unclear if that will go anywhere. And there is a Senate Bill 765 that would give a 1-year delay on the K-3 class size requirement. It would also give some budget flexibility to North Carolina school districts. It's a Democrat bill, so I don't know if it will go anywhere. But that's generally what I've been looking at with regard to bills so far this session.
Okay, and Monika, when she was talking about the one bill that talked about restoring flexibility in the calendar, I wondered as a school board member what that made you think about. Because you've been struggling.
So many thoughts about all the bills. So the call I actually just webinar I was just wrapping up before this is really making sure that we continue to remind people, and most of you all know this, especially those of you on the panel, the number of restrictions that come with our calendar law. And you know, as someone who spent 20 years doing public policy, the first thing I said when we got out of the march is, who's going to start moving this calendar bill flexibility now? Because so many of you know, especially in Wake County, but across the state, we're being impacted by these 10 extra days being added to the current school additions that were made, which I guess they're calling them flexibilities, but we can start school by August 17th, but we have, session law days, remote learning days. And the reality is, when we're creating a schedule, especially in a district, your large districts where you have year-round schools, modified schools, traditional schools, we are limited in the flexibility in creating a calendar that really works for teachers, parents, and our community at large, because we're trying to squeeze in professional development, work days, as well as making sure that we're having consistency in teaching and learning. And so those things are not true right now. And we don't really have the opportunity to maximize a calendar in a way that we feel would be best for teaching and learning. And so the first thing I can think about is, will we end up with the opportunity in North Carolina to create a calendar that really works for students?
Interesting, and Terrance can talk about this because he at NC State today, they announced that they're changing their calendar. All the UNC system is changing their calendar to start earlier, not to have fall break, and to end before the winter starts, basically to have December as an opportunity for kids to be at home. And the key point about that to me is that the UNC system can make that decision. They're able to go through, but of course they have to go through the UNC GA, which, and it has to be a uniform decision. But, but they're doing what's best, I think is best for the operation of the universities and the kids, and school boards don't have that anymore. You cannot respond to local issues and so forth. And, what about the local funding capacity? I want to talk about that just for a second, because we've all kind of skipped around it a tiny bit. But Monika, you're sitting in that seat, where Kris, you mentioned how much the revenues are down, and it's all across the state. So right now, where if the state's being penny pinching and the state's holding back even the federal money and doling it out, and we don't have any sense of what the state budget will be. We didn't even get any raises this year, right? And then what can you count on locally? This must be a big strain locally to be looking for funding.
Yeah, I mean, and Wake County has been fortunate that our county residents and our county commissioners have been really responsive to Wake County. However, what we also still know is we're still, like everybody else in this state, still suffering from the recession of 2008 and 9. We have not recovered from the last recession. And the thing that I keep saying to people is, we had tremendous lessons learned that 12, 13 years later, we are still falling behind on where we should be on per pupil spending. And we've taxed our community. I mean, we know that as a board that Wake County has really required a lot of our community to be supportive of us through our county appropriation. But the reality is the county is also preparing for what a recession means for them. They're tightening their belts. And ultimately, where that leaves us is, with legislative impact alone, we need $18 million to do what the state says we have to do. So that's increased benefits for employees, that's testing, the number of costs that we're charter payments that we're required to make. That's not including opening a new school or keeping up with growth. Those are the things that we're required to do. And so when I think about what's going to be the impact with a $4 billion budget deficit potentially at our state government, the county government being prepared, the reality is, and we're of course saying, okay, where can we get COVID dollars from, but recognizing that's one-time money. And so, yes, we're asking the county, and yes, we'll want our state appropriation. We'll want what the federal government gives school districts directly for our USDA and feeding program. But the reality is all of those are one-time and very specific, and really do not help us meet the needs to just open the doors and run a school district with over 160,000 students. And that's the reality that's looming before us every single day right now is, what do we do when we know that every branch of government is trying to prepare itself for the deficit, but yet our students are still going to be at a deficit? And that deficit that we've seen exacerbated, or the way I keep saying that the covers are off. The inequalities in this country are clear. Our safety nets are broken. That's clear. Anyone who thought that we were exaggerating the impact of poor people and people living on the margins, we see it with COVID-19, and we are going to see it even more once we actually start really feeling the financial impact in this country. And that scares me for our students.
So think of these two figures I looked at yesterday. I think I think Kris, the NC Justice Center may have put these numbers out, but I saw where we looked at Wake County, and Wake County had, I believe it said, I have it here, some right here, 23% of the residents are low income, working poor, or in below poverty. 80.9% have no health insurance. But listen to this in Robeson County, just a few counties south of us, 15% have no health insurance, 54.8% are low income.
That's right.
And these figures were as of recent, the most recent figures, which was last year, right? So think of the first 5 months of this year and think what this figure is going to be. And so when you're talking, Monika, about $18 million that you have to have locally just to stay even. Let's just take new kids in and pay for health insurance and retirement for teachers. So Kris, what is going to happen to our low wealth communities and our rural communities? How are they going to be able to pull together the funding on this?
Well, I think it's important to remember it's not their responsibility. When it comes to funding the operations of public schools, the responsibility is clearly on the state government. That's what our Constitution and our general statutes say. So let's not put it on them, and having to deal with austerity budgets since the last recession, since 08-09. So asking them to do more when they've already been trying, they're already tapped out, essentially. I've got a paper that I've yet to be published, but is looking at the lessons of the last recession and which school districts specifically suffered the largest funding reductions from the last recession. And if you look at school age poverty, and if you sort your districts by school age poverty, it's the districts that have the most students from families with low incomes that disproportionately had the largest cuts in the last recession, and their funding has not recovered from from pre-recession levels. In our highest wealth districts, funding on average is about back to where it was 10 years ago. But we know that that's using conventional measures of inflation. I think the actual cost factors facing our schools have risen much faster than inflation over the past decade. So our schools are across the board doing more with less. So what needs to be done? I think one is that we do need more federal support, but we can't be against raising revenues at the state level. There are still a lot of folks disproportionately at the top end of the income scale who are sailing through this all right. My wife and I are doing fine. Jim Goodnight is doing fine. There's still money to be found in this state. People who aren't paying their fair share, and our General Assembly can find ways to not just avoid backsliding, but actually make progress, even in the face of this pandemic. When you look at the share of our economy that we spend on our public schools in North Carolina, compare that to other states, we finished dead last in school funding effort. So there's a lot of room to be doing more. The tax cuts that have gone in place since 2012, since the General Assembly took control, they're draining $3.6 billion from state coffers. That's a decision that we made in North Carolina that few other states made, and that's we're paying the bill is coming due now because we have these huge costs that are now due, and it will require reversing those decisions. Otherwise, if we don't make those decisions, once again, we're going to balance the cost of this recession on the backs of the North Carolinians who are most vulnerable. We're going to balance on the back of students from families with low incomes. We're going to balance on the back of students of color. We're going to balance on the back of teachers. And I just can't imagine doing that again, but it's a real risk given who's in charge of the General Assembly right now.
Well, Kris, I have to say that as you're saying that, I totally agree with you about the the responsibility in our state constitution for the state to fund public education. But I also hear Monika, and Robeson County will not have to be able to generate 18 million. They won't be able to generate $1 million probably of local funds to add in. So then that's what happens, right, Lindsay? That's the Leandro case. Because what will happen is that Robeson County kids will do with what they have and what the state gives them. And Wake County will do more. And with the money they can raise locally. They will have more staff in the building. They'll have more media folks. They'll have more supplies. They'll have more hotspots and technology. That's just the reality of the inequity. And so, Lindsay, I really appreciate, I'm going to kind of end this part of the conversation by going back to where we started, which was the Leandro case. And the Leandro case has been 25 years, you said, Lindsay?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, almost for
20
many of the of my friends, their entire life, their lifetime has been, we've been waiting for this case to come forth, and it was very hopeful, and it's really going to be tragic if this is used. But Kris, when you were talking, I'll say this last. I was counting since the recession, and so a child who started kindergarten during the recession is graduating this year. Is graduating. Our 2020 graduates that now won't even get to have their formal graduation ceremonies. They have had their entire public education career under the pressure of inadequate funding and at less funding than we had in 2008. So that's really kind of heartbreaking and a really sad way to end 2020, isn't it? To think that. So, okay. So I want to, if there's anything else I want to add here, if not, I want to kind of move on to the other thing that we've been talking a lot about, and of course, Lindsay, you're not the only one that's struggling. At least you got your door closed. I'm trying to get my slideshow to work right. I'm sorry, y'all. I hit the button and it goes the wrong way. But one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about, and Lindsay, you've been following this very closely and writing about a reopening of our schools and the things we need. And Monika, you and Terrance have too. But the CDC has come under some criticism recently in terms of not putting out any information, not putting out any guidelines. Well, they actually did finally put out these decision trees, and this one is for reopening our schools. And I was wondering if y'all can comment on this a little bit in terms of what you think about it, and do you think we can do these things? Are we going to be able to go through this decision tree and really accomplish what they get these yeses? Considering that we were worried that the CDC would come out with some stuff, when you look at these suggestions, they're pretty spot on, right? They're a little stringent. Can we do this?
I will just start with just my experience as administrator and a teacher. Just on a normal pre-COVID school day, a kid is going to arrive with needing support for hygiene, need additional clothing, needing food to eat, etc. So now with this rigid process, we're now asking schools to have additional protective gear, having additional space in the school building that has already reached capacity, to acknowledge and abide by the social distancing. You also are asking buses, transportation, to find space and find drivers and find a way to, and I've rode on the school bus before, and there's no space for me to just ride along with the students, to have this distance between students. And then depending on the age range within the school building, the maturity to actually adhere to the distance is going to be something that is need to be looked at, and how do we finance hand sanitizers at every door opening, or gloves or masks for families that can't afford it? These are some questions that I have for this document. Just get past the first yes.
You're in column 1.
Right.
Okay, Monika, you're sitting in the hot seat, right? You're on a school board.
Right.
You have to open school. I mean, the governor said yesterday that he hoped we'd have schools open in August. The General Assembly has set a date that you have to open by. Column, what do you say? Here we are. Here's column 1. Okay, so I'm going to move to this slide and make it a little easier to see. Should you consider reopening? You have to say yes to all these things.
I mean, you know, it goes back to, again, our structure of public education in North Carolina. The governor has already said he's assuming we're going to open in August. The General Assembly has already given us a calendar. And so when we're talking to parents, or even just as ourselves as parents or educators, the reality is we're asking a question that we've actually been, the power has been taken away from us to even make a decision. So essentially what school boards in North Carolina are being faced with is, how much of this can we do, and how do we do it? How do we pay for it? How do we actually implement it? Because the yes is not up to us. So as of this week, the decision is made that North Carolina schools are going back to school on at least by August 17th. That is the reality that we're dealing with today. Now, no one is going to be surprised that my colleagues on the Wake County School Board and my colleagues across the state all have a million contingency plans. But the other part about us having contingency plans is our contingency plans are as good as we write them on that piece of paper, because the reality is, even if the General Assembly or the governor makes a change, we will still have to fit our contingency plan into whatever parameters they set forth. So I think that's the hardest part for me as a school board member, is we are operating in the parameters that were set by 2 other bodies before it gets to the school board, who's ultimately responsible and responsive to our families and constituents. So as you can imagine, we have 2 sides of this that we're hearing from parents who were saying, put them all back in school, besides the CDC decision-making tree, because they feel like kids are safer and have been least impacted by COVID-19. And then you have people all the way to the other extreme of, I'm not going to send my child back. And so what we don't have in writing is, how do schools deal with, even if we could answer yes. So even if some miraculous way we can social distance, we can hand wash, we can sanitize, we can monitor to ensure those things are in compliance, face covering, PPE. If we do all of that and we open the building, we still have the fact that in Wake County alone, we have thousands of children who are medically vulnerable. And we don't actually have a plan of how to address that. So, you know, we've had people saying, would my kid be able to go to virtual school? Well, we've talked about what we believe and what the data support currently says for virtual public schools, but Wake County doesn't have the right to say you can go to a virtual public school. The virtual public school has to actually accept that child. The other piece of that is, if we talk about homebound, we don't have the resources now to actually implement homebound fully the way that we need to, and that's in Wake County. So our rural communities, not all of them even have homebound as an option. So if we open the door and we follow all of these policies, the reality is we still are going to have a subsection of kids who are not medically able to come to school, because they really shouldn't be out for all the reasons that they're medically fragile, in addition to families who are absolutely not ready to enter the real world again, with people and the unknowns. And so the hot seat really for us is helping families understand that we are just emotionally invested in trying to follow what the CDC says, fitting into the state guidelines, matching what the governor says, and then realizing that these are children and teachers' lives. And I've only talked about children. I haven't even talked about the fact that we have adults who are also medically vulnerable, who also have children and families that may not be able to go to school. So I haven't even discussed teachers and other faculty in the building. We haven't even gotten to how do we deal with that on a bus. Last year alone, Wake County had 100 buses that were sitting there because we couldn't fill those bus drivers. So essentially, even if we said, well, we're going to this is what socially distancing look like, we don't have the capacity to transport students who actually need to be on a bus to get to school. And so you're back to a whole nother inequity that students can't go to school if we don't actually provide transportation for them. And that's if we get to all the yeses here. There are still so many unknowns about thinking about reopening that I will tell you, I feel like my colleagues across the country, not just this state, are saying, we're going to do what we're told today, and we all are very aware in our heads and our hearts that we are not prepared to reopen schools to be able to follow the guidelines that everyone would feel safe with, and more importantly, taking into considerations both the children and the adult safety and well-being. And those are real things, and I haven't touched the mental health. And the fact that our children are grieving losses that they didn't have in school, they're grieving isolation. We haven't even touched the mental health impact. I've done 3 different listening sessions with young people, and I can tell you the number one thing for them is they miss their social interaction. They are ready to come back to a school building. They're using words like grief and stress and sadness and depression and isolation. For me, as someone who spends my life working on children who've been traumatized and have extremely high ACEs scores, this is absolutely a form of trauma that we're going to have to start calculating what that means for mental health for our students. And so I could go on, but I'm sure Lindsay, who's done a lot of great writing on this, also wants to weigh in. But I will tell you, my heart is heavy because there is no way with certainty I can say that I don't believe our country is ready to send our kids back to school.
So that said, and not to, and I want Lindsay to speak, but that said, we've got hundreds and hundreds of parents every day on our Facebook page saying to us, we need to know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
We need to know what the plans are. What's going to happen August 3rd? What, they got your calendars yesterday. Wake County for the passed the calendars for next year for y'all who didn't get to see that as an example. And so the parents cheered that, right? Because they liked the calendar, but mostly they wanted to know something. So
Right.
here we are. What you said, it's heartbreaking, Monika, because you're saying, I don't know how we're going to do it, but you got 60 days to do it.
And we're going to do it, right? I mean, you know that. I mean, the plan that we've laid out is what we'll do. One, because we're legally bound to do that. And so with heavy hearts, we will absolutely implement what we've released. The good news is we haven't voted on our calendar yet, and we are getting a substantial amount of feedback, which is good. But we also are saying, and here are still the parameters that exist, and how do we fit these things in? And to your point, Yvonne, you said it best. School districts do not have the opportunity to weigh into what would be good or the best solution for our students and our families and our educators, whereas at least our public college institutions are able to really look at what's the best way for well-being. There are things, we have contingency plans that we're thinking through of what does it look like for staggered entry? What does it look like for phased in entry? What does it look like if we don't return? What kind of online teaching models exist? How much do they cost? How do we actually bring all of our teachers on to professional development? So, I mean, that's 4 contingencies alone, right? Staggered entry, partial entry, meaning do we start at lower grades and leave some students, like our older kids, on complete remote learning? Does everybody, the option of everyone still going to be on remote learning? We are literally talking through almost daily about these other 4 plans that we all know that we need to be considering, and what do we need to have in place? Because again, what we also know is our governor and Dr. Cohen have been really good about being as medically and health conscious sound as they can be based on the research. And so we do have to be prepared that inevitably what we know today could be very different by August.
I'll just jump in, full disclosure, I haven't done a ton of writing on reopening. I've done a lot of writing in general, but this is such a new thing and it's quickly moving. I feel probably more confident speaking from the perspective of a parent, as we are getting, toward the end of the year and looking at fall, also slowly reopening the state. I think a lot of parents are concerned that everyone is working hard to come up with a plan for August 17th, which is great. But as other states are reopening, we're seeing this resurgence of cases. We're also seeing some news about how children are being impacted by this virus. It still sounds rare, but we don't know if that will continue. And so my fear is that, you know, folks like Manika and school boards do, you know, put together these incredible plans, and we get to mid-July or August, and it becomes clear that we can't even reopen our school buildings. So that brings me back to what kind of economic impact is this going to have on the workforce, but also, you know, what kind of impact is this going to have on rising kindergartners? I have a rising kindergartner who you met earlier, and he's going to a Spanish immersion elementary school. That's wonderful. I can't imagine starting that remotely, you know, or building relationship. So that's scary. And you know, the struggle for parents, which is probably obvious to most, is desperately wanting our children to continue building their social, emotional resilience and relationships with their teachers, but also keeping them safe and keeping us all alive. It's just really hard to imagine all of this. And I read the CDC decision tree, and I imagine how incredibly costly it would be to keep us all safe. And my fear is that it becomes this massive unfunded mandate. And so somehow we have to come up with a plan that is potentially accomplishable, but is made clear to all of our leadership that it requires a significant commitment at the federal and state level and local levels to fund this, to keep us safe and healthy and alive.
Yeah, and I have to
Terrance,
say,
you know, you've got the same problem. I mean, you have a kindergartner, he's going to start first grade next year. And I think you started this section of the conversation on how can we even keep our kids, how can we put them on a bus? How do you talk to your kids about wearing a mask?
yeah, I will also say to you the thing that we haven't said that is weighing heavy on me too is people with privilege and means will be able to make decisions that are well for their families, and those who are not will not be. And so for me, as someone who values public education and sees it as a paramount part of our country's infrastructure, we will absolutely see the haves and have-nots broken out in a very different way than Leandro even addresses. We will see it in districts like Wake County, where parents can make decisions, because our private and our charters, they have small classrooms. They're completely online without any worries. They don't have to meet what the state says. They don't have to open because the governor said they have to open, right? Your public schools are required to do whatever the law says, and that's it. And that means that those students and families who have to go to work, who can't make another option, who can't afford another option, those students will be on a bus in a school. Whereas, and we, you know, and the sad part is we know this to be true. People are talking about it. I'm getting calls from personal people that I know saying to me, I will not send my kid back to school. And I love public school, but I'll pull them out of public school if you require them to go back. Those are not threats. Those are real deep-seated fears that those of us who love public school also have those exact same fears about what it means to send our students back without being able to meet all of these things on the decision tree. That I feel like I can't be on this call and not say that is a real threat to me, and it's a real threat to public education, and it's a real threat to students and families who won't have an option because financially their finances will be a part of whether you get to choose what you do. And I think that that's a reality that most people don't want to talk about, but it is the one that is looming for me.
And
It's a
to that,
reality that has, sorry, go ahead, Lindsay.
just to that
Go ahead.
point, I've also had a number of contacts ask me about virtual charter schools, right? As a way to sort of opt out of this whole situation and essentially use publicly funded online materials to school their children. And the people who are able to do that are people of means, right? And so this segregation element that's happening in our public schools is just going to potentially intensify, I think.
Kris, I wanted you to go ahead and speak.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that this issue of parents not returning to, their children to school in the fall has huge financial implications as well. One of the, so I didn't mention in the those COVID bills that passed early at the very beginning of this month, there were also some policy changes in there as well. One that I was trying to advocate for behind the scenes, but was unsuccessful, is holding districts funding, or ADM, holding that harmless at the 1920 levels, because we know there are going to be huge issues with attendance when we return to school in the fall. And according to state law right now, the state will then have to slash public school budgets in accordance with those attendance decreases. So I think that's something we urgently need to get in place as soon as possible, is something they're holding their per student fund, their average daily membership numbers, holding that harmless to the prior year, so this doesn't come up again.
Oh my gosh, I hope that everybody who's listening right now and who's listening later to our recorded session, if you don't do anything else, leave with this thought about asking your legislator to hold ADM harmless. I think it's probably it is the key concern I have right now, because Monika, when you're talking, what we know is the only way we can counter some of those folks, Lindsay, you want to go to a virtual charter school which does not perform. We know that we would be still better off as a public school system to have Wake County Public Schools, Robeson County Public Schools, schools that have certified teachers delivering remote learning. Even with all the constraints we've talked about, they're still doing a better job at it and are accountable and responsible, and we can see what's happening, right? And so it just gives me this shivers to think about all our kids moving into remote learning outside of the public school system. And I'm hoping that we can have some kind of a balance, Monika, of some kids who won't be coming back right away with some kids who will be in the classroom, so that we can keep them engaged. And Kris, I will say to you, and I hope Monika doesn't hit me for this through the screen, but even now, about the ADM holding it harmless, even now we have kids who are not attending school in every county.
I'm hitting you through the screen.
And I'm saying that the school districts are doing their best. It is really hard to engage children, in a distant learning situation for week after week. Some of it has to do with connectivity. Some of it has to do with moving around where they are staying at and living. Some of it has to do with their parental ability to supervise their time. So we have a lot of kids now who are absent. And, that very quickly moves into the fall starting, and then they're absent and unenrolled. And then that becomes a huge problem for our school system. So Monika, here we are, we're sitting here, we're looking at the decision tree, and every single person here has tied it back to funding. Because your only shot, it seems to me, at getting yeses in these blocks is money. Can you have the protection equipment you need? Yes. Can you screen? Yes, if you have the funds and you have the tests. Can you check temperatures? Yes, you can have a little temperature gun or a temperature checking station. Yesterday, a friend of mine went to the doctor. She went in, they've retrofitted. Everything is a wand. You don't have to touch anything to get in a door. When you walk in, they have a temperature checking station. You just walk up to it and it shows you your temperature, right? And a hand sanitizer pump, wash your hands, and a little dispenser of mask. Well, that would be a great setup to have in every school bus, right? But that takes funding.
The cost.
Okay. And so, just to think about our schools across this county, what Kris must be almost close to 3,000 schools. To think about what it would cost to retrofit their bathrooms with hot running water. Half of them don't even have running water.
That's right.
To put dispensers in all the hallways or outside of all the places, to have every bus with a hand sanitizer pump on it and a bag of mask. So this is funding. And then the thing I thought was really interesting, and I think it speaks to two issues that we've always had. The second column had social distancing. So what are we struggling with, Kris, on class size chaos? We've already, remember that hashtag?
Yeah.
We're still living under that, right, Monika, of having reduced our class sizes from K through 3, and we didn't have any space, and it came with no money to create new space. And so social distancing and requiring it, are we not back to, class size chaos or space chaos in a huge way? The third column, I've just zeroed on one thing, which is monitoring, two things, monitoring absences, right? That's what usually we have social workers and counselors doing. We don't have enough. Now we don't even have a social worker in every school. And then the other one was to check on the health, monitoring health. So that requires a nurse in every school or a certified nursing assistant, some kind of health professional. It doesn't have to be an RN, but an LPN. But so look at every single column here. There seem to be doable if you had the money.
With cost.
You can run dual shifts at Athens Drive High School across the street from me, right? They could go 7 to 3 and 3 to 9. But what does it cost, Monika?
Yep, and we've talked about A day, B day, the options are there. So the other cost we haven't talked about is our workforce costs. So it's all of those costs that we need to actually build that in, but our workforce is also going to be a cost. If we stagger days or create shifts into school, those are things that we have to consider. That's our educators, but it's also our staff who clean our schools, clean our buses, drive our buses, prepare our meals. All of those are going to require, if not double, at least 1.5 greater staffing capacity will be needed to manage something like that. We haven't talked about the actual, to your point, retrofitting a school building. Our state law says K2 has to be on the first level. Well, that's going to be an issue even if you could get just K2 in a school with social distancing. In most of our schools, and especially if you look at our rural communities where they have older buildings and they're 2 or 3 stories, there's no way you could actually even social distance K through 3 in one school building. You're also talking about desks. Many of your K2 classes have desks where there are 2 students sitting at a desk. So you're talking about, how do we change even the seating arrangement, the cost for that, the time for people to come in and retrofit those buildings. So that's the other cost I don't think we've really talked about is human capital costs as well.
So think about this, Terrance, you've taught a middle school class of boys. Think about if you were teaching at 7 to 3 and you took a lunch break and had to teach 3 to 9, or you can't do it.
But also, Yvonne, a cost that really is not mentioned in any of the steps that I've seen is I actually had a loss of a family member to COVID-19. So there's a loss that occurs that the crisis of the moment don't give us time to even grieve about. Is then I have to communicate that loss to my kindergarten son. And then he has to go to school and be in a school that has to share a social worker with 4 or 5 other schools, share a nurse with 4 or 5 other schools, share a psychologist with 4 or 5 other schools. We can keep going on. The amount of funding that's needed to put support staffs in the schools for this moment of grief is going to be significant. And if you don't pay that cost, it's going to fall on the teachers again. And that's my fear in this whole 3-step process.
So, we've been talking a lot about what school districts and school boards have to do, but, I think it's important that we don't leave the whole conversation without talking a tiny bit about, what I saw. I want to go back. I see a question that's popped up that's kind of related to what we're talking about right now. I don't want to push over it, but it said, what about high schools like in Wake County that have 2,000 kids? And most of the classes have 40 kids in them. So they were saying that, Monika, and not just the kindergartners, you know, 2-story, 3-story buildings. But how about most counties, and rural counties are saying here too, that a lot of rural counties only have one high school. You know, it's they have like 2 elementaries, a middle,
Oh, the
and
issue is K-12. I mean, yeah, I didn't mean to allude to the issue was only K2, but the physicality of K2 is much harder to deal with because you can't move them throughout the school. So even if you did staggered days or alternate half day or every other day, we could probably have a better chance of figuring that out for your older kids because they could be in any building at any time. I'm just saying K2 has the added challenge that you can't move them beyond the first floor and that their physical furniture is also an additional concern. This problem is going to be pre-K to 12. So absolutely, there's no easy fix for any grade level, but you have some additional concerns when you're talking about K2 around spacing and furniture that doesn't exist for K-12 if we came up with the ideal solution of either, like I said, half the students go to school on Monday, Wednesday, and the other half, because that's the other option for teachers, is not to have them at school 7 to 3 or 3 to 9, but potentially having them go to school every other day, which many of our schools, we have several high schools that are A day, B day as well. So that's one of the options that people across the country, school districts are looking at. And so of course we started to talk about here in Wake County is what is the option of A day, B day look like. So that would impact reducing the number of students in every building.
So one of the questions is, what do these kids, parents do with the kids on the day they don't go to school?
That's absolutely
A lot of people have to go to work. They have to, you know, so what about daycare?
Yep.
And Lindsay, you had said in the conversation you and I'd had, even if you could do daycare on the other days, your daycare is right back into the virus environment, right? I mean, it's not solving, not exposing.
My concern is if we go to a staggered schedule, like, you know, students go Monday, Wednesday, and then Tuesday, Thursday, they have off. You know, parents, especially those working on the front lines, can't stay home with them. And so private industry may, you know, step up and say, we can provide a space, right? Which, you know, in theory would make sense. And that's great. But what problem are we solving if ultimately those students then go to another facility and engage in another peer group and spread germs? I mean, it's just, I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
I think for me, my opinion, and I feel strongly and openly about this, we are trying to create a solution when the answer really is our students probably should not be back in the school building. And I think people are afraid to say that that's really ultimately what we're talking about, because any solution other than being in or out is the number of problems will continue to be compound, and there is no right answer here. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that we're having these circular conversations because ultimately we all know that there is not a good solution here, and whatever decision we make is going to negatively impact the families without the means and support systems greater than it will other families, regardless of the decision we make. So if we go back, those families don't really have the same options to choose to stay home. If we stay home, they still are going to be dealing with how do they care for their students. And to Yvonne's point, in North Carolina, the State Board of Education, I think at the end of the third quarter, most school districts in this state had between 20 to 40% engagement from students. The entire state, not just Wake County, I think we were actually on the higher end of engagement. And you know how engagement was defined? Logging in, not going to class, not showing up every day, but it was simply what percentage of students did you have engage in school? I mean, none of us feel confident that that's where we are. And we haven't even talked about the impact of learning loss. I mean, we have social and emotional loss that's happening, but it's also learning loss for our kids as well. And so I can't let us get off this call without acknowledging to parents with the questions. We all have these questions because we realize that we're trying to make a decision that is, no matter what we do, is very difficult and emotional. And there's going to be a lot of struggle and I think even more emotional toil and strife for all of us.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of deem us that we've kind of talked about enough about local funding, legislators and so forth, and move us a little bit to, to talk a little bit about teachers and parents, because a lot of our guests tonight are teachers and parents. And one of the things that they're saying is, are we getting input from teachers and parents? As Kris, is there anything going on in the General Assembly that allows parents and teachers to have input? Monika, do you have anything locally? They're very concerned. How do parents get a chance to have input, ask questions, be a part of the solution? And educators too, they're the ones that we're going to be putting back in school buildings. So any thoughts on that, or anybody know of any opportunities for parents and teachers? And what is your advice? How should they get involved?
It's difficult because, like Monika just said, there are no good options here when it comes to this question. But there's obviously a lot that the General Assembly could be doing to make the list of bad options available to our school leaders some less bad, to make it a little bit easier. So there are plenty of things they can be advocating for. So from no cost items like allowing greater school funding flexibility, allowing greater calendar flexibility, eliminating a bunch of reporting requirements that are still in place. This last COVID bill added a bunch of new reporting requirements that unfunded or more hoops for our districts to jump through. And then on the funding side of things, I think, obviously the list of needs is, close to infinite. Before this, we knew from the WestEd report that our schools were underfunded. According to WestEd, the group that came in as part of the Leandro case to look at our schools, that our schools are underfunded by about 40%. And that's before they faced all these additional needs. I was looking through some of one of the reports I was looking at prior to this call was from the Learning Policy Institute, and they looked at how the handful of countries that have begun to open their schools again, some of the steps they've taken. I started to think about the costs. We've touched on several of them. Diagnostics, transportation. We can't do that. Can't fully fund transportation in Wake County as it is, but to safely run transportation, they'd need to be running transportation, 2 or 3 times, the level of what's currently run. Cleaning our schools, hazard pay for, making sure we are paying enough to attract adults back into the building that might not feel safe. The additional mental health needs, devices for students, home connectivity. We talked earlier about how one of the barriers is not just, in many parts of the state, there's no option to get broadband, but even where there are options for broadband, a lot of families can't afford it. And if broadband is going to be a necessity of taking part in the public school system, as it clearly is going to be for at least the foreseeable future, that really has to be provided at no cost to families and to teachers as well. And then the issues with extended school day and year, if we are on schedules that are A and B schedules or half days or however we're spacing out the children in order to allow social distancing within the school building, there's that issue that will require more school days, and that's more labor for our teachers, for our principals, for our instructional support that they need to be compensated for. But also, even if we could have all of the children in the school building at once, based on the learning loss that has occurred over the past several months, I think we would want to have an extended calendar anyway. So, and then, if we are going to have social distancing, we'd need additional teachers to keep the class sizes low, maybe have school districts looking at renting other buildings in order to to have classrooms that are socially distanced. I mean, it's crazy, and that's a huge laundry list I've just given you, and I'm sure it's not complete. There are tons of things I'm not thinking about. I'm glad I'm not in Monika's shoes and having to actually make these decisions, because it's overwhelming to even think about.
But
I would say
parents need to start advocating for that stuff. They need to get the General Assembly to write our school districts a big check and not put any strings on it, Let them spend it how they need to spend it based on these crazy needs that are popping up left and right, and get out of the way.
And also
Yeah.
to
Okay,
Chris's,
go ahead,
I do
Lindsay.
want to add that, you know, we were expecting a consent order from Judge David Lee, who's overseeing the Leandro case by now. It's been pushed back to at least June 1st, and I think it may be pushed back even further. That may potentially give some parameters around what the General Assembly is required to do to meet our constitutional obligation. And I think that can be a mechanism through which parents, teachers, the general public can ask our leaders to absolutely fund more school nurses, more school psychologists, some of
Yes.
these things that are being put forward to keep us safe and healthy. There's a constitutional obligation to ensure that every child can access public schools. And if they have to do that through broadband internet, then that's a legal lever there for everyone to be able to access broadband internet. So I think that's how teachers, parents, general public can move the needle on this. And we need to come together to figure out how they can communicate that to their leaders.
Yeah.
And you know,
And locally,
I want to leave a few minutes for us to answer a few. Let me throw a few questions out here, and maybe some folks can grab them. Somebody's saying, is it legal, basically, to monitor my child every time they enter a building, and what does that do to their mental health? I don't know the answer to that. As a social psychologist, I would say. I'm just not sure. I think it will vary on every single child. And then, you know, one of the things we didn't have time to really talk about is what parents can do. And I think parents are trying to do that, talk to their kids.
that's right.
I think that that we see that there is some normalizing going around this with kids now. They kind of get what we're talking about. They understand it to a certain degree. But that's a very important question. And that's another reason why we need those helping professionals in the school, because my grandson may have no problem. Terrance's son may have big problems because he's had a death in his family. You know, there's going to be a variety of needs. So when those kids come in the school, you've got to have somebody there to help. And no teachers cannot do this. They cannot run a social distance classroom and go have time to sit with 2 or 3 children who are struggling with the realities of what this happens. We're gonna, and a parent here is saying, well, what about high school? Yes, high school, we know, right?
That's right. Agreed.
Tell your juniors and your seniors to put on your mask.
Yeah.
Okay, we have some real discipline problems coming with implementing some of these situations. Another person said, my concern is, according to the CDC, is recommended that children will not have recess together, but they're going to be in the same classroom with the same teacher from start to finish and eat lunch and everything else. Is this something that the school system, you know, is going to be able to handle? And you know, they're very concerned about, you know, how is this going to really be possible, that we're going to be able to, you know, keep all the kids in one room, feed them, they can't go outside. What is going to happen with the teacher? How realistic is this?
And how healthy is it for any of them? Not at all.
Okay. So let's see. A couple other things. Are there any, someone's wondering here, what's going to happen with end-of-grade testing or end-of-course testing? You know, how are we going to do assessment in the future? Anybody talked about that or heard anything about grading?
So testing is waived. So when you talk about kind of your standardized testing, however, for this year. So, and that's even for your ACT, our 11th graders who generally take it, they'll be able to take it in the fall, assuming all goes well. So that's one piece of this. But again, when we go back to school, I mean, certainly, and I'll let Terrance, the educator, speak into this. You know, teachers already do some level of formative assessment when their kids return, and there's absolutely been conversations across the state of North Carolina of, do we give the end of grade testing to every student when they start back I'm a person who believes formative assessments is probably a better assessment to assess where kids are, but I'm not an educator, so I'll punt that over to Terrance. But all of those things are questions. And in terms of grades, the state set the standard on how we would also grade. And so reminding parents that both Wake County Public Schools and the board, the North Carolina Board of Education, all of our meetings are on YouTube. And so I also refer people to go back there. But a lot of those standards were set last month. And so there's definitely, again, back to this guidance, we all got a significant amount of guidance around grading and what we were grading and whether we were grading new learning or remediating students. And so there's been a lot of conversations around what we've been doing versus what educators believe we should be doing. And that's another place I'd like for teachers to be weighing in, is be weighing in with your public school officials, but also be weighing in with your state board of education, who's setting the tone for what grading and testing looks like across the state.
So this question a teacher's saying is, would you consider running a dual system, one remote for kids who don't want to come back into the classroom and one for kids who do? And she's certainly doesn't mean it, she's not ignoring the issues of equity that brings about, but she's saying, is it realistically something we can do? Because she doesn't want her kid to leave the public school system, but if she has a vulnerable child, what's the alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the options that I think both Lindsay and I brought up that people are absolutely asking us. Again, when we go back to what's possible, we're also talking about cost, right? So if you have kids who are in a school, that's a set of teachers. Those same teachers cannot be teaching your online learning as well. So I'm going to go back to, I believe all of those are options that should be on the table, but we have to recognize that we are funded for a teacher based on ADM per subject. And so if we're at risk of risking our ADM, then who pays for those teachers and how do they get paid? Because are those students in the public schools ADM? Could we run and these are questions I can't answer. These are questions the state is going to be left answering, is could a school district legally run a complete remote and in person? At the local level, I don't have the ability to say yes or no to that.
Okay. And there are two other questions I want to circle back to, and then I'm going to let us all close up. But one is the recommendation that we've been pushing is the concept of how do we get internet to be a public utility?
Absolutely.
I know there was Kris, you might remember, there was a bill a couple years ago that Tillis introduced. Do you remember that? I can't remember the details of that. Do you remember? Someone's asking, and I just can't remember, but I knew that Wilson, I think the city of Wilson had it as a public utility.
Mm-hmm. And the bill outlawed municipal broadband.
Yeah.
So, the concept is that cities and could provide internet like they do water and sewer and trash collection and recyclables to make it very cost effective. And in fact, I work with a lot of international students, and the one thing they always say to me, and Terrance and I've talked about this so much, they go, oh my gosh, where I'm from, we have very reliable high-speed broadband, and even in very rural areas, and it's cheap, right? And they come over here and they're just stunned at the cost that we have to pay to have, high-speed, reliable broadband. So how would we, the question is, how can we go about lobbying and advocating for that? Is that it's something we should do at the federal level or the state level?
Was there a bill introduced for that? I can't remember. I was trying to look without putting my head down in my phone.
Right.
This year, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of bills addressing broadband, but I don't know if there's been anything addressing it as it to become a public utility.
Okay.
There are ways at augmenting
The cost.
a state grant program called the GREAT program that would provide funds to internet service providers to incentivize them to ramp up broadband adoption. But as far, it's a privatized system, and as far as making that into a public utility, I don't know how you do that.
The limited research that I've done, I'll answer what I know for the question for the person is that it probably needs a federal designation. At this point, probably the only way, I mean, that might be the way to actually see it happen, because even there's a program called Lifeline, which is a federal program, which allows a lot of people to get internet, broadband in pretty inexpensive ways. But you have to be income eligible, and it's limited. It's only funded to a certain number of slots, so to speak. So one proposal I know that is being pushed to the federal level is to broaden that out and put more money in it. So I think this is an issue at all levels that we're going to have to deal with. It's going to have to be. Go ahead.
It's interesting. The federal Lifeline program started as a way to get telephone access to rural households back in the. And so, of course, that's public
It
utility.
started off with just getting people phones so they could call when they're, and get help, and so forth. And
a good lever toward making it into a public utility. I don't know how you do that.
right. So the other thing they're asking, this is the last question I'll take, and then then one more. I see one more. It says here, how can we encourage and motivate parents to change their negative attitudes about virtual schooling after the pandemic? How can we hold students and parents accountable for virtual learning, since it's going to have to be part of our reality? So there.
I would, I think every parent's doing their best, and blaming parents for the failures of a system absolves the system. So I would encourage that person to not blame parents and to blame the policymakers that have established the system that is putting too much on parents to succeed.
Well, and I would offer a moment in between all that to say that I think that some of the negativity that has been around it thus far has been because we haven't had reliable internet. We haven't had access. And Monika said at the beginning, when the teachers were told, hey, tomorrow you're all going home and next week you're going to be teaching online. So we did not have any degree of staff development. And I do think that if, we're talking about this in a year from now, we're still doing some amount of remote learning and interaction, I think people will have more positive attitudes. I've seen, watching my grandson, I've seen from the first class they had to the classes they're having now, and it's remarkable, right? What, a teacher has done from like not really being much on the internet, right? Mm-hmm. And now being a Zoom queen and doing breakout rooms for the kids and tremendous activity. So I think that it is something that it will become more, come better. Then the last question is, people were saying, what can we do and what can we learn from all of this about feeding our kids? Universal breakfast and lunch. Can we please move towards universal breakfast and lunch? Yes. Okay, so anybody who wants to talk about that or talk about ways we need to advocate for it, please jump in.
Go ahead, Kris.
Go ahead. No, I was saying that's something that we've been advocating for at the Justice Center for years. And it's another one of these things that I think until this moment, a lot of people just didn't have their imagination tuned in to think of it as a possibility, but it's really something, based on my calculations, we could do universal free breakfast and lunch all across the state for about $120 million, which in a $10.5 billion budget really isn't that big of a change. So it's something that we should have been doing a long time ago, and it's clear now that we should be doing it.
Absolutely.
I want to help you advertise all those numbers and figures, Kris, or send me something on that. I want to really be your megaphone on this, because I also support that and have been supporting that for years. And in fact, Kris, I know you can't do it now, but I've always wondered about the heavy administrative costs of managing free lunch or reduced lunch and getting co-pays and nagging children for money they didn't have and trying to collect monies. I've often wondered that wouldn't it be a wash?
Think about that. Start thinking that way of any means tested program.
Yeah.
Well said, Kris. That's it. You're
So
right.
when you think about all of that, you know, and one of the things too that Monika, y'all been doing in Wake County some is what they call grab and go breakfast. And one of the things I want to say about that to parents who are listening is it just fits in perfect with the pandemic, right? Because the kids come in, they pick up their juice box, they pick up their fruit, they pick up a granola bar, or and really what they do is they put it in a bag and they go. They grab
Yep.
and go to their classrooms. And we may have to do grab and go breakfast and grab and go lunch anyway in the future, so that kids are not going to be in cafeterias gathering together. And we need stuff that's disposable and doesn't have to be washed and, you know, cleaned. And our cafeteria space can be used for classroom space. So the grab and go is a really good model for a lot of these things. I think we're all nodding. Everybody jumped in to speak on this. So to our guest person, yes, it makes sense. And you know what's been remarkable? I've been to a couple of the distribution sites, and guess what's going on there? Nobody's asking people to prove their income.
Absolutely.
If you drive up and you need food, any family that drives up and they need food, the food has been handed to them. So this income requirement for hunger is, to me, a stain on the character of our country, really. That you have to prove that you're income eligible when you're hungry. I just find it remarkably unkind. And I think Kris hit it, that maybe what we've learned in this whole thing is that a lot of things we're been thinking were good to do, guess what? They're kind of good to do. But so I'm going to let you guys now each have a chance, if you would like, just that kind of make some closing remarks and on anything that you would like to share from this conversation, your advice, things that you think we need to be doing. We have a lot of parents and teachers listening, and a lot of people who want to advocate for what's best for our kids. So I invite each of you to take a moment to do some closing thoughts.
I will briefly just hit on a point that Lindsay talked about earlier in the Leandro report. Race matters in the impact of COVID-19. Black and brown communities are hit very hard by infections and death. And also what we're seeing is that same community, that same demographic was trying to just get an equal playing field before COVID-19. So there's work to be done around the disparities that center around race and rural versus urban. And so I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that race is still is playing a role in our response to COVID-19.
So I do want to say that whoever is left to do closing remarks, people are saying, what can we do? Give us some concrete steps. We're all, you know, we want to advocate. Tell me some things to do. Those are some of the comments that are coming in. So Lindsay?
I'll go next. I know, you know, for those who haven't been paying attention to this Leandro lawsuit that's been going on for decades, it may seem a little bit abstract, but I do think that this summer will offer an opportunity for members of the general public to look at what the courts hand down in terms of what they believe the state needs to do to reinvest in the system of public schools. And that can be a lever for all of us to say, this is what we need, not only to ensure that every child has access to a sound basic education, but also to ensure that we are healthy and able to keep learning for the rest of the year and for the foreseeable future. So from our organization, from the Public School Forum, and from many of our partner organizations, I would look for information from us coming down the road this summer about how to connect these dots and how to advocate to your lawmakers for increased support for our public schools, not only in the context of COVID, but in the context of meeting our constitutional obligation to fund all of our schools and to provide sound basic education for every child.
I'm happy to go next and let Kris close us out. I mean, very concrete things that I would say as we, as a school district, that are true for us before COVID and definitely still true, and I think even more pronounced now, and that is advocating for flexible spending, flexible calendars. I mean, these are very concrete things that limit that when parents give us recommendations, we have to refer them back to what the state statute says. And I know it feels circular to people because parents and teachers do a great job of talking to us as school board members, but those are two very specific things. And then I would also add to that, that when we're talking to both our commissioners and our legislators, is that parents and teachers are expressing their own personal fears, because there's nothing like connecting a personal story and experience to the ask that you're making, so it doesn't feel abstract. So when we're using the talking points from Leandro, or the talking points that Kris will give us from figures for universal breakfast and lunch, these are concrete things that impact every one of our students. We have legislators who are looking to introduce bills for nurses and social workers in every school. Those are absolutely things we want people to be advocating for. And then recognizing that if we have to do anything unique with schools, that we also are going to have to address teacher pay, and the fact that we pay teachers in 10-month intervals, and we're going to be asking them to do something significantly different. We're also going to have to address teacher pay. Those are very concrete things that impact how schools make decisions of opening and functioning in whatever capacity, but it also impacts the people who are responsible for teaching and learning.
I think that's great. I want to, mess up, the ending there. I'll just add to what Lindsay said. If anyone wants to get plugged in to advocacy efforts, send me an email. My email address is Kris, that's KRIS, at ncjustice.org, and we'll get you plugged into some of that work that Lindsay was referring to.
Okay, so I'm going to close this out now for Public Schools First, and I really just want to say to everyone who's been on here tonight, thank you. We've had some great comments and some great questions, and to really aggravate, agitate, engage, and advocate, we've put together a little fact sheet here, and it's on our website. If you go to publicschoolsfirst.org under resources fact sheet, things that we think are critical to opening new schools. And it's we change the document every week. So if you have some great suggestions, or I'm going to go back from the notes I've taken from Kris and Lindsay and Terrance and Monika, and I might revise it tonight, because it's a growing list of things that we need to do. But we did it really to encourage conversation and to give you some talking points. And so I hope very much that you will go there and look. And we do have also a page on the Leandro. I put it in the chat box, but go to Public Schools First NC. And I would like to say that all of the partners on to calls tonight are just absolutely brilliant and have lots of resources themselves with their organizations, and a lot of personal knowledge. So if we didn't get a question answered tonight, if you send it to me or put it in the chat box, I'll get back up with any of these folks and others who are interested in making sure that we engage our parents. I want to end with one last thing, and I want to encourage you to consider that for the last 3 years, Public Schools First NC, and I know that Public School Forum also been working really hard in the areas of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. This is something that Terrance and I have probably done a training on or a webinar on, or most of them in person, showed the film. We've shown resilience, paper tigers, broken places. We've been working really hard for a solid 2 years on trying to make sure people understand adverse childhood experiences and the opportunities to overcome trauma and to deal with trauma effectively and teach our children to be resilient. I have to bring this up here now because it is so critical that if we already knew that we had about 20% of our kids in Wake County schools to 25% who are already experiencing 1 or 2 ACEs already. And so we already know that even children who have not previously been in that category are moving in quickly. So this is, again, part of our advocacy that we've been doing across the state is showing how inadequate it is. We have so few social workers, school psychologists, counselors, and nurses. So friends, really, after you advocate for flexibility of counters and spending, please advocate that your children and their teachers have the resources they need in the school. A lot of the work of social workers and counselors are also to train teachers and educators. They do staff development and they develop programs to help teachers be more effective in discipline and managing classrooms and helping children, and as well as connecting families to services in the community, and then really providing direct services to our children. I will tell you that before this happened, for 3 years in a row, the data across North Carolina and in Wake County has shown that the suicide alerts have gone up 10 or 15% in high schools every year for the last 3 years before COVID-19 and the pandemic. So we know that we're going to be facing a lot of serious issues. So if you don't know a lot about the whole area about trauma and adverse childhood experiences, on our website, we have a special page that's just resources around the COVID-19. So we encourage you to please, please, please go and look at some of these resources. And we encourage you to let Terrance and I do some webinars with you. We do great training on how to deal with strategies in the classroom and for parents and PTAs and teachers. So let us know, because we don't have anything to do now. We're just hanging around. So please call us and let us know. And we do have one more series set up at this time. Next Thursday at 8 o'clock to 9:30, we're having another set of panelists. The wonderful Christine Spears, who works with school equity, making sure in Wake County. We have Michelle Burton, who is the president of the Durham NCAE. We have Justin Parmenter, who is an educator in Charlotte, North Carolina, and somebody else at this moment. Oh, Christine Kushner is going to join us from the Wake County School Board. So we're going to have another round of different topics that are related to this, and we hope that you will tell your friends and neighbors and you'll join us again. And as always, I have to do the commercial so that my board will keep me going. And that is, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. We have wonderful things on our YouTube channel now, and we really encourage you to get involved. No matter what you do tonight, you've met some wonderful people here. Cincy Justice Center is in the house, Public Schools First is in the house, Love Justice Foundation in the house, Public School Forums in the house. So please look at all of these faces and names and consider them as on your team for advocating. Because the one thing that we're all investing our time in is that we believe that every child has the constitutional right to a sound basic public education, regardless of their race, their gender, their income, or their zip code. We believe this, we've dedicated our lives personally and professionally to advocating for children. And I hope the pandemic has brought us to understand that what good for your child is good for my child, that every child in North Carolina counts. And so I thank you, friends, for indulging me tonight and sharing your evening with me and helping make this so successful. So good night and have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
You too.
Stay
Thank
safe,
you.
stay healthy. Hey, Lindsay, you can open the door now. Bye-bye.
Bye.